Hi, my name is Rachel, and today I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite journalists of all time, Nellie Bly. She was born as Elizabeth Jane Cochran on May 5th, 1864, in Cochran's Mill, Pennsylvania. She was called Pinky as a child because she wore that color so often, and later on, to be seen as more serious and professional, she added an E to her surname and, of course, shed that nickname. Her father was the founder of the town and ran the mill, and he died when Bly was just 6 years old. And unfortunately, he left the family with nothing because he didn't have a will. So Bly's family had to move to Pittsburgh, and Bly originally was planning on being a school teacher, but she could not pursue higher education due to financial struggles. So she was introduced to journalism in the early 1880s when she responded to a sexist column in the Pittsburgh Dispatch. This column basically implied that women were only good for having babies and doing housework. So she was a strong, independent woman. She did not like that. And George Madden, the paper's managing editor, was so impressed by her response that he published it and later offered her a job, which she began in 1885. She adopted her pen name Nellie Bly after a Stephen Foster song because it was unsavory for women to be journalists at that time, so they had to, have pen names. And she began to write about women's issues and did some undercover reporting to expose the poor working conditions for women in sweatshops. She also served as a foreign correspondent in Mexico and wrote a book about her time there. But she was kind of critical of the government there and for their censorship of the press, so she sort of had to go on back to Pittsburgh after a little while. And another interesting thing about being a foreign correspondent in Mexico was originally her editor told her, no, you can't do that. You're a young single woman. You can't go without a chaperone. So she was like, fine, I'll take my mom. So she did. But anyway, after she came back from Mexico, the Dispatch was sort of boxing her in and making her write about exclusively, quote, women's issues like fashion. And I can imagine after after serving as a foreign correspondent that that would be pretty boring to her. So she relocated to New York City in 1887 to expand her career and explore some other options. So she began working for the New York World, which was run by Joseph Pulitzer at the time, and one of her earliest assignments was to investigate a mental institution on Blackwell Island, which is now Roosevelt Island. Not only did she investigate this mental institution, she feigned symptoms of a mental illness to be committed to the institution for 10 days. So she described these horrible conditions and abuse, and the fact that a lot of the inmates at this mental institution weren't crazy. They were actually immigrants that didn't speak English and had just been sort of locked away and just left to rot in these asylums. And this like really horrified the public. So they demanded action, and eventually conditions became better and more money was allotted to the care of the mentally ill. And that all came about as a result of her expose. So that was sort of her first majorly known contribution to investigative reporting. And she also published a book about this experience called 10 Days in a Madhouse, which was just even more detailed and honestly horrifying. So the other thing that Bly is really well known for is her race around the world. In 1889, Bly left for a trip around the world in which she attempted to beat the record set by a character in the Jules Verne novel Around the World in 80 Days. So it was considered very unusual for a woman to travel extensively by herself at this time, and her editor initially refused her when she asked to do this story because, she was a young single woman and that was inappropriate and dangerous. But also, one of my favorite reasons that he gave for telling her that she couldn't do it is that women didn't know how to pack light. But eventually, she wore her editor down and he realized if we're not going to fund this, someone else will, and then she'll just end up getting another paper or some publicity. So he eventually agreed to let her do it. And in November of 1889, she left on a ship from New Jersey And just to spite her editor, who said that women didn't know how to pack light, she only carried one bag with her, and it was full of some changes of underwear and some essential toiletries, and then she carried all of her money in a pouch around her neck. So, that also just really speaks to her general attitude and personality. Something I find really fascinating about her is that she never takes no for an answer. All of her most famous achievements started out with her male editors telling her, "No, you can't do that. You're a young unmarried woman," and they all end with her wearing these editors down with her persistence to the point where they're finally like, "Okay, I guess you can do that." And then she ends up doing that and more, and just brings about her own success and success to the newspaper even more. So that's just something I really like about her personally. But anyway, so the Cosmopolitan, which was the New York magazine, it was in its infancy at this time, and they decided that very same day to send their own young female reporter the other direction around the world to race Bly, sort of making it a competition and increasing the circulation and popularity of both papers. The other female reporter that Cosmopolitan sent to race Bly, her name was Elizabeth Bisland, and that's her on the left, whereas Bly is on the right over here. And I don't think you can talk about one's race around the world without, talking about the other. So you would think that these two had a lot in common, and I mean, certainly they did. They were both young female journalists, and they were setting records in a time when women couldn't even vote. So that was pretty cool. But they also had very different backgrounds and personalities. Bisland was from an old Southern family that used to have a lot of money and was fairly ruined by the Civil War. And by all accounts, she was very easygoing and she loved to travel with the British because she liked the luxury and um, she really liked the languages and that kind of aspect of the travel. She liked the other cultures, whereas Bly, well, obviously she had a more working class background and was raised in the North, but she was also very competitive and described as abrasive, and she, on the other hand, detested British imperialism because they had influence in every corner of the world, she soon found out. And she was way more concerned with beating Bisland than enjoying her travels, so she really picked up the pace once she found out that she was in a race against another young female reporter, and she did end up winning that race, traveling around the world in about 72 days and setting a new record. Bisland, on the other hand, arrived about 4 days after Bly. When Bly returned from her trip around the world, the whole country had been following this race between herself and Bisland, and this made her somewhat of a celebrity, which was unfortunately not the best thing for her career at the time because it meant that she no longer had the option of going undercover because she was so well known. So she retired from journalism temporarily, and she later married a millionaire who was 40 years her senior. His name was Robert Seaman, and that's him on the left there. Her husband died in 1904, leaving Bly with a fortune, which she then used to run his company, the Ironclad Manufacturing Company. She actually owns the patent to the 55-gallon steel drums used for storing oil today, and of course the real credit belongs to her employee who invented them himself. His name was Henry Warhan. But anyway, the company succumbed to debt because Bly was really invested in trying to make sure all of her employees were receiving fair wages and at the time some kind of radical benefits like healthcare and access to clubs and fitness centers like that. Um, so anyway, after the company went bankrupt, Bly was forced to come out of retirement and start writing again. And she worked for the New York Evening Journal writing about the women's suffrage movement pretty much until her death. She died of pneumonia on January 27th, 1922 at the age of 57. And something I just think is interesting about her later years is that not only was she a pioneering female journalist who made a huge mark on the field of investigative reporting, but she was also one of the first female owners of $1 million company like this. So I think that's pretty cool. This is a picture of her gravestone. This was dedicated in the late 1970s later on, and it's located in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Nellie Bly's contributions to journalism and society in general were very important. She was a pioneer of investigative reporting, and she used this reporting to bring about social reform. In other words, it was journalism that made a difference, and I think that's just one of the most important functions of journalism today. She was always attacking sexist ideology and promoting feminism from the time that she was just 16 years old and responded to that column in the Dispatch. She even confronted the negative stereotypes about Mexicans during her time as a foreign correspondent. Her record-setting trip around the world was not only a feat for journalists, but a feat for all of mankind and womankind. She wrote multiple books about her experiences and continued writing about things that mattered to her until her death. Investigative journalism continued to evolve from Nellie Bly's 10 Days in a Madhouse to Upton Sinclair's The Jungle to Woodward and Bernstein's investigation of Watergate. Nellie Bly is not without critics who say that her ways of doing things were unethical or gimmicky, but without the earlier methods of these pioneers, it's really difficult to say where we would be today in terms of society and journalism, which is why I think we owe Nellie Bly so much gratitude. I love this quote by her. I feel like it really just sums her up as a person. She says, "I've always had the feeling that nothing is impossible if one applies a certain amount of energy in the right direction. If you want to do it, you can do it." So here are my sources, and thank you so much for watching.